Number 15. Rad AlMansuri. To make ends meet as a single mother of two, Denise Olis Arancibia turned to escorting. Unfortunately, the 38-year-old's risky line of work led her straight into the path of a diabolical killer. In February of 2024, employees at the Soho 54 Hotel in Manhattan discovered Denise's lifeless body in her 11th floor room. Laying nearby was the bloody iron that had been used to bludgeon her to death. The killer had struck Denise's face so hard that bits of plastic from the iron were embedded in her skull. Police also found a bloody pair of jeans with a receipt in the pocket. There were no signs of forced entry into the room, indicating that Denise had let her killer inside. Denise's devastated 18-year-old son, Edwin Savalos, told the New York Daily News that he did not know what his mother did for a living, but that he knew she worked hard to provide her kids with a good life. She always made sure her children had everything they needed, and that the family's bills were covered without having to borrow money from anyone. Investigators had little to go on in the way of leads until weeks later, when 26-year-old Rad AlMansuri was arrested in Scottsdale, Arizona, for allegedly stabbing a McDonald's worker in the neck. While in custody, AlMansuri told police that he was wanted in New York City and to Google the Soho 54 hotel. He now faces a murder charge in connection with Denise's death and is slated to be extradited to New York to face his day in court. AlMansuri was captured on surveillance footage leaving the hotel in Denise's leggings, which he wore because his jeans were covered in blood. According to the New York Times, he murdered Denise during an argument over the length of his appointment. Detectives now believe that AlMansuri may be responsible for more unsolved assaults and murders throughout the United States. He has had a history of attacking women, which includes an arrest in 2023 for kidnapping and assaulting an escort in Sumter County, Florida. 9 days after the discovery of Denise's body, and shortly before the stabbing involving a McDonald's worker, AlMansuri allegedly carjacked and stabbed a woman in Phoenix. The FBI has gotten involved in the case and is working with various law enforcement agencies to identify more cases that AlMansuri may have been involved in. Number 14. Like mother, like sons. In a disturbing act of violence that was captured on camera, a Florida mother and her 2 adult sons allegedly beat a disabled man in a wheelchair with an iron bar. According to police, surveillance footage shows 39-year-old Evelyn Rodriguez jumping out of her Jeep with a metal pipe in hand and striking the victim, Wesley Victor, as he arrived home. 20-year-old Jonathan Gonzalez and 18-year-old Jason Chavez were also implicated in the attack, and all 3 suspects are out on bond while facing charges in connection with the assault. Rodriguez accused Victor of instigating the altercation and denied that the victim is wheelchair-bound. She claimed that the same security footage that was used to implicate her in the crime also shows Victor standing up and fighting back. The Lee County Sheriff's Office clarified that Victor is disabled but can walk a few steps on his own. Victor told WINK News that he had met Rodriguez through his neighbor over a month earlier. They formed a friendship, which took a sour turn when Victor began suspecting Rodriguez of stealing his laptop charger. He denied slashing Rodriguez's vehicle tires like she had accused him of, but he said that he believed that she genuinely thought that he was responsible for the act of vandalism. Either way, the rivalry clearly spiraled out of control, and Rodriguez and her sons are now waiting to face their day in court. Number 13. Alexi Varakin. In late 2023, the decapitated remains of a 40-year-old Russian escort named Olga Vorobuyova were found outside a hotel in Moscow's Izmailovo district. The following day, another escort, 25-year-old Vladiskitskaya, was murdered inside her flat in the city's business district. Investigators traced both murders to 37-year-old Alexi Varakin, a convicted killer who had recently been released from prison after serving time for 2 previous murders. Back in 2010, he had been committed to a psychiatric hospital for killing 2 escorts who caught him stealing their purses. He was eventually declared sane and released, but as his recent actions prove, he was far from cured of his disturbing affliction. Following his release from the mental facility, the Tashkent, Uzbekistan native reportedly lived in isolation in a hotel. Varakin allegedly visited Olga in the same hotel during a drunken bender and beheaded her when she refused to be intimate with him. Then, in an effort to de-stress after killing Olga, he went to see Vlada. Varakin stabbed the woman in a fit of rage when she mocked him for being unable to perform in bed. Vlada fought for her life and managed to call a friend during the frenzied knife attack. Her neighbors also heard her screaming and alerted authorities, but by the time the police arrived, the young woman was dead. The evidence suggested that the killer had tried to sever Vlada's head before fleeing the scene. According to the most recent available updates, Varakin remains in custody amid an ongoing investigation into the murders. Number 12. Kelsey Miles. Police in Grand Prairie, Texas received an unexpected visit early one morning in March of 2024 when a young woman entered a station at 5 a.m. and confessed to killing her 80-year-old grandmother. 30-year-old Kelsey Miles admitted to shooting Betty Lou Hearn in the head at the home they shared in Dallas County and told the police that the gun she used was in the car. Officers recovered a Smith & Wesson .380 from the vehicle and paid a visit to the address provided by Kelsey. When nobody answered the door, they forced their way inside and found Betty Lou dead on the floor with a gunshot wound to the head. Kelsey remains held on a murder charge with a bond set at $750,000. Authorities have not suspected a motive for the alleged crime, which came as a shock to Betty Lou's longtime neighbor Nathan Jackson. Speaking with Fox 4 News, Jackson described Betty Lou as a second mother to him and other neighborhood kids during their childhoods. He also expressed shock that a family member is accused of killing her. Fox 4 reached out to relatives who declined to speculate on a possible motive and seemed more focused on processing the tragedy that had upended their lives without warning. For now, the outcome of the case remains to be seen. Number 11. Horus Taylor. British retiree Horus Taylor did not have a license to loan money, but that certainly did not stop him from doing it at cutthroat rates that were not only unfair, but in some cases proved nearly impossible to pay back. According to authorities, the 73-year-old perused pubs in search of elderly and frail victims who suffered from significant health problems and survived on public assistance. In other words, he targeted people who looked like they needed money and probably could not pay it back on time, then offered to loan them the cash. No amount was too big or small for the callous loan shark, who charged double interest to customers who failed to repay their debts on time. In one case, Taylor charged a pensioner £20 for a £10 loan. The man paid the money back and continued to borrow. He typically repaid Taylor on time, but eventually he fell too far behind to get caught up. After defaulting on a £380 loan and repaying £1,440 to settle the debt, the victim thought he and Taylor were square. But Taylor was unsatisfied with the amount and continued to pester the victim for more cash. Another customer also started out by taking small loans, but eventually got in over his head. The person ended up borrowing £560 and paying back twice the amount in order to get Taylor off his back. In addition to charging ridiculous interest rates, Taylor threatened to harm people and blow their houses up if they failed to repay his illegal loans on time, or if they failed to pay the outrageous late penalties. The elderly loan shark had absolutely no compassion for victims who fell on hard times and could not meet his outlandish obligations. During one conversation, he straightforwardly told a victim that he did not care about their need to pay bills. Law enforcement eventually caught up with Taylor and arrested him for his crimes. Upon taking him into custody, the police seized a notebook containing records for around 30 recent loans. Taylor was uncooperative, claiming that he had just loaned a small amount of money to one person and that he made an empty threat against him in an attempt to get them to pay back the money. And his handwriting was so sloppy and impossible to read that prosecutors were only able to pursue cases involving 3 victims. But they were determined to seek justice for the victims and moved forward with the information they knew they could use against Taylor in court. The septuagenarian's defense lawyer tried to paint his client in a sympathetic light, telling the court that Taylor cared for his 75-year-old partner who has cancer and that Taylor suffers from health problems of his own. Taylor's attorney further argued that her client had been honest about his actions and urged the judge to impose a lenient sentence. However, the judge was quick to point out that he had actually downplayed the severity of his crimes and the impact his actions had on his victims. The judge nevertheless took mercy on the elderly criminal, who admitted to unauthorized lending in October of 2023 and received a suspended prison sentence. Taylor was also ordered to repay his victims, and as long as he lived up to the obligations set forth in court, he would avoid time behind bars. Number 10. Bassir Muhammad. In 2014, the beaten and strangled body of 69-year-old Ina Claire Richardson was found dumped along a roadside in Washington state. Investigators traced her last known whereabouts to a grocery store in Asotin, where surveillance cameras captured footage of a man approaching Richardson in the parking lot. Witnesses told police that they saw Richardson walking toward the man's vehicle with him around the same time. Their eyewitness accounts and the security video helped investigators identify the suspect as 53-year-old Bassir Muhammad, also known as Billy Joe Dallas. DNA evidence and footage from other local businesses helped to solidify the case, and Muhammad was taken into custody just days after Richardson's murder. Shortly after Muhammad's arrest, his wife of 6 years, Detra, told local station KHQ that she initially laughed when the police told her that her husband had been arrested for murder. She conceded that Muhammad had a criminal history and was a registered sex offender, but she insisted that her husband had turned his life around and was not that person anymore. Unfortunately, she was wrong, or at least that's what the jury decided when the case went to trial in early 2016. The verdict came in swiftly following closing statements, and Muhammad showed no emotion when the decision was announced. He remained equally stoic when the judge sentenced him to more than 72 years. Muhammad will be around 80 years old when he becomes eligible for parole after serving at least 26 years, which means he will spend most, if not all, of his remaining years behind bars. Number 9. Shan Cranston. The Amish are primarily known for rejecting modern conveniences, including electricity and indoor plumbing. They are also known for isolating themselves from mainstream society. Generally speaking, they leave the so-called English outsiders alone, and they expect us to do the same, except when it comes to doing business. These old-fashioned communities also take a hard-line stance against violence. They are among a few categories of Americans who are exempt from military draft, based on their religious policy of non-resistance. Given their lifestyle and benefits, murder is so rare among the Amish, it's practically unheard of. And that's why it was so shocking when a 23-year-old pregnant mother of 2 named Rebecca Byler was killed at her home in Sparta Township, Pennsylvania in early 2024. Rebecca's husband Andy arrived home from looking for roofing jobs to discover his wife's slain body on the floor and her head covering lying nearby. Rebecca had been shot in the head in front of the couple's 2 children, and she had also suffered sharp force wounds to the neck. Horrified by what he saw, Andy rushed back outside to Julie Warner, the woman who had driven him on his job search, and told her what happened. Julie dialed 911 and brought the kids outside, while Rebecca's shell-shocked husband sat in the vehicle, struggling to process his devastating new reality. The horrific act of violence shook the predominantly Amish community, where these types of crimes don't just happen. Local residents were left on edge and fearing for their safety, while police aggressively investigated the case. Nearby residents reported seeing a red Jeep parked nearby the Byler home earlier that day. The vehicle was traced to 52-year-old Shan Cranston, a non-Amish truck driver who lives about 8 miles from Rebecca's community in the town of Corrie. He was charged with murder, burglary, and trespassing. The courtroom was packed with members of the Amish community during Cranston's initial hearing. His defense attorney filed a motion to dismiss the charges, arguing that no motive or murder weapon has been recovered. But the judge rejected the motion and ordered for Cranston to remain held without bond pending the outcome of the case. Number 8. Caroline Hurling. In a nearly $4 million fraud scheme that prosecutors later described as greedy and grotesque, 44-year-old Caroline Joanne Hurling targeted vulnerable adults in Los Angeles County with plans to forge their wills and take over their properties. Also known as Carrie Phoenix and Caroline Gardner, she specifically sought out elderly victims in upscale communities. She used online mapping programs to look for unkept conditions like algae-infested swimming pool water and overgrown shrubbery. Hurling's crimes went largely unnoticed until October 2021, when neighbors reported 71-year-old Charles Wilding missing. Around the same time, an anonymous tipster reported that Wilding was dead and that he may have been met with foul play, causing law enforcement's ears to perk up. Throughout the course of their investigation, detectives crossed paths with Hurling, who identified herself as a family friend and claimed that Wilding had moved away. By then, she had taken over Wilding's assets and financial accounts using forged power of attorney documents. Unable to find any evidence that Wilding was still alive, investigators concluded that he was most likely deceased and that his body had not yet been found. They would later learn that their hunch about Wilding being dead was correct. The senior citizen had passed away more than a year earlier from causes that remain unclear to this day. After learning that his disappearance was under investigation, Hurling and her co-conspirators scrambled to get rid of his remains, which had sat decomposing in his home since his death. They took the elderly man's body to Hurling's apartment, where they tried unsuccessfully to dissolve it in a concoction of chemicals. When that did not work, they dismembered Wilding's remains and dumped them into the San Francisco Bay. The body parts have never been found. Determined to keep up her ruse, Hurling paid a man $5,000 to pose as Wilding during phone calls and an in-person interview in an effort to throw the authorities off her trail. But the hired impersonator confessed that he had been paid and told what to say, at which point Hurling's scheme fell apart. More victims were discovered throughout the investigation, including a man whose home was sold without his consent. In early 2023, federal authorities charged Hurling and 2 associates with various crimes relating to the scheme. Hurling ultimately pleaded guilty to 1 count of conspiracy to commit wire fraud and was sentenced to 20 years in prison. She was also ordered to repay nearly $3.9 million in restitution. Number 7. Isy W. Corrina Page Slusser's family first noticed changes in her behavior during her senior year of high school in 2016, when she began hanging out with a new group of friends and fighting with her mom all the time. In early 2017, she dropped out and left her family's home in small-town Bloomsburg, Pennsylvania. She spent several months living with a friend in Hazleton while waitressing at Applebee's, but eventually she was kicked out for not paying her rent. A few days later, Corina's concerned mother discovered that she had gone to Brooklyn. At first, it sounded like she was only visiting, but a few weeks later, she told her mom that she had landed an office job and was looking for an apartment. In reality, Corina had started escorting, and she was exposed to the ugly side of the industry almost immediately. Within weeks of beginning her new profession, a 32-year-old man named Giovanni Peguero was arrested for assaulting her at a hotel. Peguero had been in and out of prison since his teens and had prior convictions for human trafficking, promoting prostitution, and other disturbing crimes. A judge granted an order of protection banning Peguero from any contact with Corina. When a copy of the order showed up at her mother's house, Corina claimed that she had been robbed and that everything was fine. Around the same time, she met a 21-year-old aspiring rapper named Isy W. On the surface, everything really seemed fine in Corina's life. She had even gotten her own apartment in the Bronx and was thrilled to share photos on social media. But things are not always as they seem, and it became clear that something was very wrong when Corina suddenly stopped posting online just days after moving into her new place. She was last seen in person 10 days later outside a motel in Queens. Later that day, Corina called her mother, Sabina Torto, and said that she wanted to return home. Sabina was on her way to a funeral in Florida, but told Corina that she would talk to her when she returned to Pennsylvania. During the conversation, Corina mentioned that she could not fly because someone had stolen her driver's license and social security card. About an hour after that, Corina texted Peguero, the man who had been arrested for beating her up, and begged him to let her come see him. She said someone had left her at a motel with no money or food. It's unclear whether she and Peguero met up that evening, but she has not been heard from since. Sabina reported her daughter missing, and at first, investigators suspected that Peguero was possibly holding Corina against her will. They also looked into Isy W, who had posted escorting ads online featuring Corina and other young women. In the meantime, there were numerous reported sightings of Corina, but her fate and current whereabouts remain a mystery to this day. In October of 2018, federal authorities charged Isy W with trafficking Corina and the other woman who were featured in his escorting ads. According to the FBI, W forced and coerced both victims to engage in prostitution. W was sentenced to 15 years in prison, but the outcome of the case comes at little comfort to Sabina, who is still looking for her daughter. Peguero was charged in state court with crimes relating to the promotion of prostitution, but law enforcement officials remain tight-lipped about the details of the investigation, leaving Karina's loved ones in the dark about what they may or may not know. In the last photo of Karina, which appeared on Instagram shortly before Juani's arrest, the young woman looked noticeably thinner and had darker hair and eyes than the last time her loved ones had seen her. 3 years later, in 2021, Karina's social media accounts showed activity after years of remaining dormant. It's unclear whether they were accessed by Karina herself or by someone else. There have been no updates since then, and the case remains shrouded in mystery. Number 6. Ibrahim Morrow and Rebecca Patrick. Any skilled fraudster knows that people are often at their weakest when they are lonely. This was certainly evident to 33-year-old Ibrahim Morrow and 32-year-old Rebecca Patrick. The pair had orchestrated a cruel romance scam targeting vulnerable singles in the United Kingdom and elsewhere using online dating platforms. Like most romance scammers, the duo targeted mostly elderly individuals, then worked to gain each victim's trust. They duped their targets into thinking they were in relationships with real and well-intending partners, then convinced the victims to wire money using elaborate stories to justify the need for financial help. The pair eased into each victim by starting with requests for small amounts of money for things like winter clothing and other needs. And it worked extremely well. After all, if someone you cared about told you they had no jacket to wear in the cold weather, would it not make you want to help them? Morrow and Patrick eventually moved on to more classic-sounding shticks, including the all-too-familiar story about how the scammer had inherited a large amount of money but needed to pay a fee for the funds to be released. By then, their victims had already been sucked far enough in to continue handing over the money, even if it logically made no sense for them to do so. An elderly Australian man wired the scammers nearly £138,000 before he realized that he had been duped. Another victim forked out £18,000 based on her belief that she was in a romantic relationship with a man who did not even exist. There were multiple other victims who ponied up thousands of dollars in cash payments that they will likely never get back. After receiving the funds, Morrow moved the money into various accounts that he controlled. He and Patrick initially fell under suspicion during an investigation into the fraud against the Australian man, which led to the discovery of their other crimes. Following their arrests, Morrow and Patrick adamantly maintained their innocence and took their cases to trial. But the jury was unconvinced and found them both guilty. Morrow was sentenced to 5.5 years in prison, while Patrick was spared from time behind bars in the form of an 18-month suspended prison sentence. Number 5. Sammy Patrick. After going an entire year with no homicides, Scott County, Mississippi was hit with 2 capital murders over a 2-month period starting in late 2023. One of the slayings occurred in the town of Forest on the day before New Year's Eve, when a man broke into the home of 73-year-old D. Edie. The intruder assaulted her in broad daylight and then proceeded to fatally shoot the elderly widow and set her body on fire before fleeing the scene. Shortly before her murder, Dee overheard her dog barking while talking on the phone with a family member. She told the relative that she was going to see what the dog was barking at and ended the call. After hearing about the conversation, another family member checked Dee's home security footage and noticed that the camera had been moved or was not working. So they paid a visit to the senior citizen's home, and that's when they discovered her charred remains. Dee had no prior connections to her suspected killer, 36-year-old Sammy Patrick, who lived nearby but had fled the area by the time her body was discovered. 2 days after Dee's murder, Patrick allegedly robbed a Subway restaurant in Woodville, near the Louisiana border. Employees told police that Patrick was very polite while ordering his food, then pulled a gun on them out of nowhere. Nearly a week after Dee's murder, Patrick was apprehended by U.S. Marshals in Jefferson Parish, Louisiana, where he had been seen driving around in a stolen truck. He remains held without bond on multiple charges, including capital murder, armed robbery, assault, and possession of a firearm by a convicted felon. Number 4. Lulia Lupul. To most people, pickpocketing sounds like an old-fashioned crime that probably reached its peak popularity during the Oliver Twist era. But the crime is very much alive and well, especially in crowded cities where unsuspecting targets are a dime a dozen. In 2023, members of a sophisticated pickpocketing gang were arrested in England for stealing wallets and other valuables from elderly bus passengers. According to prosecutors, the thieves worked together to carry out their crimes. Several of the gang members distracted or blocked other passengers, while others dipped their sticky fingers into the victim's pocket or purse. At least 4 of the victims were over 70 years old. The thieves also targeted someone who had a lot of children in their care, a woman who was pushing a baby stroller, and an elderly individual who was pushing someone in a wheelchair. In other words, people who were unlikely to notice the theft, or who were less capable of fighting back or chasing the thieves even if they did notice. One of the gang's most notorious members, 41-year-old Romanian national Lulia Lupul, was accused of stealing one victim's rent money and another person's cash savings while pickpocketing on London buses. She admitted to 15 theft-related offences and was sentenced to a year in prison. After her sentencing hearing, Lupul's defense attorney told the court that his client was remorseful for her actions. He went on to explain that Lupul had come to the UK from Romania in the hopes of employment, but that she had a harder time finding a job than she expected because she did not know much English. Lupul's lawyer further claimed that the convicted thief stole out of desperation in order to provide for her kids back in Romania. However, the judge was quick to point out the highly organized nature of her crimes. While handing down the sentence, he made it clear that he knew Lupul was likely to be deported after serving her sentence. Number 3. Juan David Ortiz. After serving in the US Navy and obtaining his college degree, married father of 3, Juan David Ortiz became a Border Patrol agent in Webb County, Texas. He started the job in 2008 and spent the next decade working his way through the ranks, eventually becoming an intelligence supervisor. Little did anyone know, he was living a double life that flew entirely under the radar until September 2018. That's when a terrified escort named Erica Pena frantically approached a state trooper at a gas station and said she had just escaped from a man who held her at gunpoint. She identified Ortiz as her attacker and said that he was a regular client who frequently paid for intimacy. Pena's previous meetings with Ortiz had gone fine, and she had no reason to believe that this one would be any different. But Ortiz was acting strangely that day. He made it a point to tell Pena that he was the last person to see her friend and fellow escort, 29-year-old Melissa Ramirez, alive. The young woman was found murdered along a roadside 2 weeks earlier. Someone had shot Ramirez in the back of the head, execution style. Right before he pulled a gun on Pena, Ortiz said that he was worried that police would find his DNA on Ramirez's body. He then pulled into a gas station, at which point Pena saw the state trooper and ran over to him. Ortiz fled the scene, but Pena knew enough about him to implicate him in her kidnapping. Just days earlier, Ortiz had picked up 42-year-old Claudine Ann Luera, another prostitute he had seen several times in the past. A truck driver found Luera clinging to life on the roadside later that day with multiple gunshot wounds to the head. She died from her injuries at the nearby hospital. After fleeing from the gas station following Pena's escape, Ortiz picked up 2 more women, 35-year-old Griselda Alicia Canta and 28-year-old Janelle Ortiz, and killed them both. Like his first 2 victims, he drove the women to remote areas and shot them dead along the roadside. Unlike the previous 2 women, Ortiz had no prior contact with Griselda or Janelle. He was arrested the next day and confessed to the 3 murders that the authorities knew about, as well as the 2 other killings he had committed the night before. Ortiz described his victims as trash and dirty and said that he wanted to clean up the streets. He repeatedly expressed a deep disgust toward prostitutes, even though he himself had indulged in their services. Like many criminally accused individuals, the disgraced former lawman changed his tune and pleaded not guilty, arguing that his confessions were coerced. He was nevertheless found guilty of all 4 murders and was sentenced to life without parole. Number 2. Georgina Willoughby. Over a several-week period starting in late 2023, a British thief named Georgina Willoughby stole handbags and purses from elderly and disabled victims in Gloucester and Cheltenham. After rifling through each stolen bag for money and other valuables, charges. The 32-year-old tossed the bag and the remainder of its contents into the trash. In one instance, she slid a large coat over the back of a disabled woman's wheelchair at a hospital emergency room, grabbing the victim's handbag in the process. During another theft, Willoughby stole a woman's purse at a cafe and took the victim's bank card and money. The serial bag snatcher was caught red-handed by a cop while attempting to commit a third theft at another cafe. Luckily, though, she was arrested in time for the purse and its contents to be returned to the victim. Willoughby faced over a dozen charges and ultimately pleaded guilty to 3 counts of theft. And in the end, she was sentenced to 16 months in prison.
And now for number 1. But if you want to hear more bizarre and crazy stories, stay tuned after the video for some more content.
Number 1. Richard Flores and Maria Barrios Calero. In August of 2023, a hotel clerk in Lake Worth Beach, Florida, named Richard Barron, entered a room and saw 2 young females sitting on a bed. Nearby, an older man who was later identified as 44-year-old Richard Flores argued with another man over the payment for the room. There was also a woman on the scene, who was later identified as 44-year-old Maria Barrios Calero. It was clear that the suspiciously young-looking girls did not want to be there, prompting Barron to contact law enforcement, while Calero and Flores left the motel in a vehicle with the 2 girls. By the time they returned, members of the Palm Beach County Human Trafficking Task Force had surrounded the scene. Calero and Flores were arrested on trafficking charges, and the victims were rescued. Flores initially denied allegations that he intended to cause any harm to the girls, and claimed that he had rented the room for them so that they would have a place to stay for the night. He also claimed he gave the victims money for food, rather than for illicit purposes. But both Flores and Calero later admitted that Calero had arranged the meeting and that Flores was paying for prostitution services. In early 2024, the defendants each pleaded guilty to 2 federal trafficking counts. They could face up to life in prison, and if they are lucky enough to avoid a life sentence, they could still face prison, followed by lifetime supervision. Flores and Calero could also be ordered to pay restitution to the victims. According to the most recent available updates on the case, they are both currently awaiting sentencing. Human trafficking is a major problem in Florida, particularly in Palm Beach County. Authorities praised Barron for his vigilance and his willingness to spring into action at a time when it's imperative for witnesses to speak up for the sake of rescuing victims from this brutal trade.
Number 18. Bowman. Shortly after returning to his home in Santa Monica, California, following an out-of-state trip to visit family in November of 2021, 38-year-old Bowman took what initially appeared to be a routine trip to a local 7-Eleven store. While there, he summoned an Uber. During the ride, Mann abruptly changed his destination and contacted Uber's 911 service, stating that he was in an Uber vehicle. However, he failed to respond to the service's attempt to follow up on the matter and had vanished by the time anyone physically began to search for him. According to Uber's records, Mann was dropped off in a run-down neighborhood. Both the Los Angeles Police Department and the Santa Monica Police Department issued a missing person alert in the weeks following Mann's disappearance. But his whereabouts were a complete mystery for the next year and a half, as his worried loved ones became desperate for answers. Finally, in late April 2023, a homeless man discovered Mann's skeletal remains in the courtyard of an abandoned property, roughly 1,000 feet from where his Uber dropped him off. Mann's death remains shrouded in mystery, and authorities have revealed few details regarding what they believe happened during his final moments. But some specifics of the case have been released, including the fact that Mann's body was found beneath a mat between an abandoned shed and a wall. His fiancée, Jason Abate, told the U.S. Sun that the location and position of Mann's body suggest foul play. In his own words, he said Mann died facing a fence in a place that he would have never voluntarily ventured into. Abate described the site as being like a maze and said his partner was the type who scares easily and would have been terrified to go to a place like that. Based on the circumstances, he doesn't believe Mann went to the site voluntarily. He also interpreted the discovery as evidence that his partner didn't just collapse in place, but that he was led or ordered there while still alive. And it seems unthinkable to Mann's loved ones that he might have harmed himself, based on the fact that he bought cleaning supplies and other things at 7-Eleven that suggested he was on his way home and had obvious plans for the rest of the evening. Abate has accused law enforcement of failing to properly handle the case from the beginning and believes that investigators judged Mann for being gay and wrote him off as a drug addict. He believes that if a proper investigation had been carried out, Mann would have been found a lot sooner, given the fact that he was ultimately discovered extremely close to his last known location. For now, the case remains under investigation, as the victims' loved ones hope for justice sooner rather than later. Number 17. Little Abe Hill. After a night out drinking together in Austin, Texas in March of 2023, a man and a woman tried to request an Uber ride home. When a black sedan rolled up next to the sidewalk, they mistook it for their car and got in. According to an arrest warrant, the woman passed out shortly after getting into the vehicle. After moving a short distance, the driver allegedly pulled over and forced the man out of the car at gunpoint, then sped off with the female passenger still in the back seat. Thankfully, the man had left his iPhone in the car and was able to track its location. He dialed 911 and gave police the location of the vehicle, which he traced to an address roughly 6.5 miles from where he was forced out. Upon arriving at the residence, responding officers could hear a car running inside the closed garage. They knocked on the door repeatedly until the alleged driver, a man later identified as 40-year-old Little Abe Hill, answered. He told the cops that the car was still running because someone was in it. Fearing for the woman's safety, the officers detained Hill and went into the garage, where they found her passed out in the back seat. Based on evidence at the scene, they concluded that she'd been assaulted. As it turned out, Hill wasn't even an Uber driver. He has a felony record which would have prevented him from passing the company's background check. Authorities have deduced that he was posing as a rideshare driver when he picked up the victims. During questioning, Hill allegedly admitted to picking the woman up and claimed that he only took her to his house because she was too drunk to give him her address. Hill made no mention of picking up the man who was with her at the beginning of the ride, and he said he left her in the vehicle because he didn't want to drag her inside. A search of Hill's home turned up 2 guns, which he wasn't supposed to have due to his status as a felon. The female victim told counselors that she felt a specific type of pain, indicating that she'd been assaulted. She recalled seeing what appeared to be camera flashes during the encounter as she drifted in and out of consciousness. In the end, Hill was charged with kidnapping and aggravated assault with a deadly weapon, but because this case is so recent, he has yet to receive a sentence for the crime. Number 16. Andrew Stiller. Melissa Stiller never imagined in a million years that her husband Andrew would be killed while moonlighting as an Uber driver. But that's unfortunately what happened one evening in February 2023 as the 35-year-old drove down a service road in New Orleans East. Andrew, who worked as a child therapist by day, was transporting 21-year-old Jonelle Hampton when someone began shooting into his Dodge Durango, striking both him and his passenger. Andrew lost control of his vehicle and barreled through a fence and onto a nearby highway, where he crashed into a car with 3 people inside. Sadly, both Andrew and Hampton died from their injuries. 2 of the passengers in the vehicle Andrew hit were seriously injured, including one who was shot in the head by the same suspect who killed the Uber driver and his passenger. Authorities concluded that Hampton was most likely the target of the shooting and that Andrew was collateral damage. In other words, he was in the wrong place at the wrong time, and he unfortunately paid for it with his life. For now, however, investigators have declined to speculate openly about a possible motive in the case. Police were able to connect the crime to 33-year-old Tyree Quinn through an ankle monitoring bracelet that the suspect was wearing at the time of the shootings. Electronic monitor provider Matt Dennis told Fox 8 Live that months earlier a bail bondsman had refused to post a $225,000 bond for Quinn until being reassured that he'd be monitored. Quinn has several prior arrests under his belt, including for armed robbery, gun possession, vehicle theft, and hit-and-run driving. Andrew's widow, Melissa, doesn't think the suspect should have been free at the time of her husband's death, given his criminal history. She and other relatives of the victims are now demanding a more meaningful level of justice, than they feel has been delivered in the past. Number 15. Richard Lomate. In 2019, a time when Uber was falling increasingly under fire for the appalling number of assault allegations raised by its customers, 2 Pittsburgh women added another disturbing experience to the list. The 21-year-olds ordered a ride home from the bar through the app at around 1:30 a.m. on a Saturday. As soon as they got into the car, the male driver allegedly commented on their looks in a way that made them feel uncomfortable. Then the man parked in an intersection and said, "You're not going anywhere." According to a police complaint filed by the women, the driver tried to lock the doors, but they managed to flee the car and ran away while shouting for help. Using information from the app, authorities identified the driver as married father of 2, 36-year-old Richard Lomate, an assistant professor of information sciences and technology at Penn State University. They charged him with 2 counts of kidnapping, harassment, and false imprisonment. And shortly after news of Lomate's arrest broke, another woman came forward and accused him of making untoward advances toward her. Lomate adamantly denied the allegations, claiming the app froze and that he pulled over to wait for it to restart on his phone. The next thing he knew, the 2 passengers were running frantically from the vehicle. He said he never locked the doors and that he was confused when the women fled. A few minutes later, Uber assigned Lomate to a new ride, and he carried on with his shift. He was baffled when his wife called him and told him the police were looking for him in connection with an alleged incident. Lomate was banned from the campus where he worked his day job while the case played out in court. But in a turn of events, the judge ultimately found him not guilty following a bench trial, enabling him to return to the campus and resume his daily life. It's unclear, however, if he continued working as an Uber driver following the incident. Number 14. The Orosco Crew. What began as a normal day for a 42-year-old Uber driver in Manhattan in October of 2022 quickly turned to sheer terror when an SUV filled with 3 masked men pulled up next to him at an intersection at around 6 a.m. The trio tapped on the driver's window with guns, then dragged him out of the vehicle, covered his head with a plastic bag, zip-tied his wrists, and forced him into the back of their car. They beat the victim, stole his phone and wallet, and refused to let him go until he told them his address. A short while later, the thieves FaceTimed with an accomplice who was at the victim's home. They forced the man to tell them where he kept cash, and ended up stealing $20,000 from his son's bedroom. The gang then freed the Uber driver's hands, removed a bag from his head, and dropped him off at a random location in Nassau County, Long Island. Before speeding off, though, they warned the victim that if he called the police, they'd kill his family. Authorities traced the robbery to a Queens-based gang of thieves known as the Gasco Crew. They targeted the Uber driver shortly after committing another armed robbery that same day. The group is suspected to be the likely culprits of multiple similar crimes that occurred between October 2022 and March 2023, when 2 arrests were finally made in the case. 20-year-old Sam Carrasco, also known as Sika or Sicario, and 23-year-old Jeffrey Tavares were nabbed by the NYPD after being pulled over in a stolen Jeep. Federal investigators subsequently charged them in connection with the robbery of the Uber driver and several other robberies and carjackings. A third suspect appears to remain at large. But if convicted as charged, Carrasco and Tavares could face 12 to 15 years in prison. Number 13. Yolanda Dillian. Just days before Christmas in 2022, 911 dispatchers received a call about possible violence at a Travelodge hotel in Jefferson Parish, Louisiana. Responding officers arrived to find 54-year-old Uber driver Yolanda Dillian slumped over behind the wheel of her vehicle with multiple stab wounds. Sadly, she was pronounced dead at a nearby hospital shortly after. Yolanda was an avid churchgoer and a pillar of her community. She was known for being both kind-hearted and hard-working, and it was unfathomable that someone might want her dead. During the day, she worked as a budget analyst for the New Orleans Police Department, but she moonlighted as an Uber driver to buy gifts for her family and children at her church. Investigators retraced Yolanda's final movements to an Uber ride she provided to a customer named Brandon Jamal Jacobs. They didn't have to look hard to find the 30-year-old who was staying at the hotel where Yolanda's body was found. found. In a written confession, Jacob stated that he woke up on the morning of Yolanda's death and decided he was going to kill someone for no particular reason. When asked why he targeted Yolanda, he allegedly told detectives, "I didn't pick her, Uber picked her." During a court hearing, Sheriff's Detective Stephen Keller testified that Jacobs had spent much of the last 7 years working in Seattle as a software developer for Microsoft. He then returned to Louisiana on disability leave a few weeks before Yolanda's murder. According to Jefferson Parish Sheriff Joseph Lapinto, Jacobs was planning to kill a different Uber driver who picked him up earlier that day, but decided not to after realizing he'd have no ride back to his hotel. The subject stabbed Yolanda from behind in broad daylight, just moments after she pulled into the Travelodge parking lot. Jacobs recorded the horrifying act of violence with his phone and posted the footage on social media. A hotel employee saw that something strange was happening and asked Jacobs what happened, but he calmly ignored her and walked to his room. Jacobs is now being held without bond on a second-degree murder charge and will face life without parole if convicted. Number 12. Attempted abduction in Paris. In a harrowing account of an alleged attempted abduction that went viral on social media in 2023, a woman named Nina Scaly described how her 24-year-old sister-in-law, Lucy, narrowly escaped an Uber driver who had previously been accused of trying to kidnap and assault women. Lucy ordered a car at around 10:30 p.m. in a suburb of Paris and almost immediately noticed that the driver was going in the opposite direction of her destination. About 5 minutes later, the driver allegedly cancelled the trip but didn't let Lucy out of the car. He told her not to worry and that everything would be fine, but she was frightened enough to repeat her request to be let out of the vehicle. Fearing for her life, she jumped out of the car and ran for safety. Luckily, the driver wasn't going very fast, and Lucy wasn't hurt. According to Nina Scaly, the sister-in-law who posted on social media about the incident, Lucy is normally a very timid person. Her willingness to leap from a moving vehicle shows that her survival instinct had kicked in and that her sense of being in danger was too big to ignore. Scaly said that Lucy complained to Uber, but they didn't reply the first time. She went on to make a second report though and was refunded. Uber reassured her that they wouldn't match her with the same driver again, but it left her fearing for the safety of other unsuspecting women who might get him as their driver. This was precisely the reason why Scaly went public with the story, to warn potential victims against accepting rides from the individual Lucy accused of trying to abduct her. The post generated thousands of responses, including from 10 to 12 women who claimed to have similar experiences with the same driver. They were reportedly shocked that he was still allowed to work for Uber after reporting him for previous incidents. According to Scaly, Lucy was infuriated by the apparent lack of action against the driver, so she tried to file a police report. Law enforcement allegedly refused to let her file the complaint at first, but relented after learning that her story had gone viral online. While the complaint was ultimately dismissed due to a lack of evidence, Uber finally deplatformed the man in question. Number 11. Christy Spicuzza. To bring in some extra money to support her family, 38-year-old mother of 4 Christy Spicuzza worked nights as an Uber driver in Allegheny County, Pennsylvania. A horrifying incident that was captured on camera began like any other normal ride when she picked up a customer who was later identified as 22-year-old Calvin Crew in February 2022. About 10 minutes into the drive, the customer put a gun to Christy's head, grabbed her by the ponytail, and ordered her to continue driving. Fearing for her life, Christy said, "Come on, I have a family," hoping her captor would see her as a human being and think twice about his actions. However, the suspect replied by saying that he also had a family and instructed Christy to keep driving. She continued to beg for her life, telling the armed passenger that she has 4 kids. Crew replied that as long as she did what he told her to, everything would be fine. Roughly 75 minutes into the ride, the passenger reached forward and yanked down the dash cam, ending the video. Christy's abandoned car was found about a day and a half after she vanished. A few hours later, a delivery driver discovered her body in a wooded area. She'd been shot in the back of the head. Her dash cam and cell phone were found along 2 different roadsides, and investigators soon discovered that the suspect had accessed Christy's Cash App account during the deadly drive. Calvin Crew was charged with murder, robbery, and tampering with evidence. According to a criminal complaint, the suspect's girlfriend, Tamaya Mullen, ordered the Uber ride for him on the night of Christie's death. At some point during the ride, Mullen allegedly texted Crew saying that she wasn't going to jail if they got caught, and to this day she hasn't been charged in connection with the case. Crew's attorneys fought to ban the prosecution from pursuing the death penalty, but have been unsuccessful thus far. According to the most recent updates on the case, prosecutors remain intent on keeping the death penalty on the table. Number 10. Aaron Orosco. Like many people, 38-year-old Marine veteran and father of two, Aaron Orosco relied on his income as an Uber driver to support his family. As a night owl, he willingly worked during the late hours that most people avoid. But something went terribly wrong between Orosco and two male passengers outside a 7-Eleven store in Linwood, California in March of 2023. Orosco pulled into the parking lot at around 1:30 a.m. and got into a physical altercation with the men. During the confrontation, one of the suspects pulled a gun and fatally shot Orosco in the upper torso. Unfortunately, he was pronounced dead at the scene. One suspect fled on foot, while the other sped away in the victim's car, which was found abandoned a short distance away. Orosco's widow, Sandra Medina, told ABC 7 Los Angeles that her husband had felt unsafe at times during his 3 to 4 years working as an Uber driver, but he never mentioned fearing for his life. At the time of his murder, the couple had started to consider moving out of Linwood due to an uptick in violent crime. According to the most recent update from law enforcement, the investigation is ongoing and no arrests have been made. But Uber released a statement reassuring the public that it had banned the account connected with the suspects. Number 9. Christopher Miller. 26-year-old Carolina Vargas was working as an Uber driver in Tennessee when a customer kidnapped her at knife point in 2020. It all started when she drove a truck driver named Christopher Miller from Nashville to a hotel in Cleveland, roughly a 2.5-hour drive, while mechanics repaired his vehicle. The trip went fine, so when Miller asked Vargas to pick him up in Cleveland for a return trip to Nashville to retrieve his truck, she said yes. This time, they made arrangements outside of the Uber app. Vargas later said that she began to feel uncomfortable when Miller ordered her to take an alternate route to avoid traffic. Shortly after that, he allegedly brandished a knife and ordered Vargas to drive south. She later said that she begged him to let her go, but he refused. While driving down a highway at 60 miles per hour along a part of the route that passes through the state of Georgia, Vargas realized her only hope of escaping her captor was to jump out of the moving vehicle. She later told NBC affiliate WSMV-TV about how she quickly unbuckled her seatbelt, grabbed her phone, opened the door, and jumped. Vargas miraculously made the exit without breaking any bones, despite having her legs run over by her SUV. After landing on the pavement, she lost consciousness and sustained multiple cuts, scrapes, bruises, and other injuries. She also lost 3 front teeth as a result of her escape. A Good Samaritan then pulled over to help Vargas while the suspect sped off in her SUV. Despite her injuries and the fact that she'd most likely need reconstructive surgery for her missing teeth, the decision to jump out of her vehicle was a no-brainer for Vargas. In fact, she credited the terrifying leap with saving her life. Authorities caught up to Miller in Jacksonville, Florida, and charged him with kidnapping, false imprisonment, assault, and auto theft. He allegedly had several guns in his possession at the time of his arrest. According to Fox 17, he had a criminal history involving previous charges for theft of a tractor-trailer, larceny, and failure to pay child support. Vargas said that Miller showed no signs of being a dangerous person during the first Uber ride, and that she never would have said yes to a second trip if she had even a slight inkling that he might jeopardize her safety. The outcome of the case is unclear, but it's safe to say that Miller will get what he deserves in the end. Number 8. A not-so-happy holiday. The 2022 Christmas holiday likely seemed like a good opportunity to make some extra money for an Uber driver in Minneapolis, but the exact opposite happened when he was robbed and carjacked during his shift. According to court documents obtained by Fox 9, the driver took 23-year-old Antoine Demondre Townsend Davis and 20-year-old Kavina Takira Terry Ford to a gas station and then dropped them off back at home. After arriving back at the residence, though, the pair allegedly told the driver to remain still and threatened to shoot him if he moved. They took his phone and wallet and demanded his passcode, then forced him to drive to a nearby ATM. The machine was out of cash, so the driver returned to the same gas station he'd taken his customers to earlier, where one of the suspects withdrew $1,400 in cash using the victim's card. Townsend Davis allegedly forced the driver into the passenger seat, then drove to another bank where the suspects attempted to withdraw more money from the victim's account. They ended up transferring the funds to Terry Ford's girlfriend's bank account via the Zelle app, then ordered the Uber driver to exit the vehicle and sped off. This is all according to charging documents. A few days later, the suspects were accused of robbing a gas station using force, violence, and fear of injury. Townsend Davis turned himself in 4 days after the Uber carjacking, and Terry Ford was taken into federal custody the next day. Now they each face 2 counts of robbery in violation of the Hobbs Act and 1 count of kidnapping, as well as 1 state-level charge of second-degree aggravated robbery. Number 7. Sabrina Ben-Altaif. During a night out in London with friends in 2016, Sabrina Ben-Altaif left her phone in the Uber she'd taken from a bar to a nightclub. She contacted the driver shortly after arriving at her residence, and he told her he'd swing by with the phone. When Sabrina saw the car pull up and approached, she reached her phone and began to thank him for bringing it to her. But the driver allegedly began demanding money in exchange for the phone's return and threatened to call the police. As he waved the phone out of her reach, Sabrina grabbed onto the car with one hand and began digging for cash with the other. She shouldn't have had to give the driver any money for her own phone, but before she could grab any out of her purse, he began to drive off anyway. Sabrina's memory of what happened next was foggy, but she knew she was dragged by the car. She woke up in a hospital bed with stitches in the back of her head and severe neck pain. Uber suspended the driver pending the outcome of an investigation, but the incident left Sabrina afraid to continue using rideshare apps. She told the UK Sun that she reported the incident to police and said that her complaint was backed up by witnesses, but a police spokesperson told the news outlet that they weren't investigating the incident and that no further action would be taken. Number 6. Kamal Asalak. A young Boston woman's experience as an Uber customer in early 2021 was nothing short of terrifying. She'd hailed a ride in the city's Brighton neighborhood at around 8:30 p.m. one evening and was picked up by 47-year-old Kamal Asalak, who she'd later describe as behaving strangely. While it's unclear what made the woman so uncomfortable, it reached a point where she asked Asalak to stop and let her out of the car. He complied and pulled over, but instead of letting her out, he allegedly activated the child safety locks. In a desperate attempt to get someone's attention, the woman screamed and banged on the windows as the driver laughed and climbed toward the back seat. The frightened passenger managed to maneuver her way around Asalak and into the driver's seat, enabling her to unlock the doors and escape the car. At some point during the bizarre interaction, Asalak reportedly told the woman that he was just kidding. Police arrested Asalak on suspicion of kidnapping, and Uber immediately kicked him off the app after learning about the incident. At his initial court hearing, Suffolk County Assistant District Attorney Margaret Hegarty described how the driver allegedly said, "Hey babe," and told the customer that her ride was going to be an hour long. This was despite her request to be taken to a place that was essentially just around the corner from where she was picked up. Asalak pleaded not guilty to the kidnapping charge. His defense attorney, Thomas Cherokis, suggested that what happened may have been a misunderstanding resulting from a language barrier between his client and the customer. Cherokis further pointed out that Asalak had performed thousands of trips for Uber customers over a 4-year period with no complaints. But unfortunately, the outcome of the case is unclear. As news reports have revealed in recent years, being a rideshare driver can be dangerous or even deadly. Number 5. Anjali Ramchandani. A 4th-year medical student named Anjali Ramchandani made a regrettable decision in 2016 when she was filmed attacking an Uber driver and throwing his belongings out of his vehicle In a drunk fit of rage, the 30-year-old allegedly got into the car without a reservation and threw a tantrum when the driver asked her to exit the vehicle. Footage captured by Juan, the customer who'd ordered the car, appeared to show Ramchandani kicking and punching the driver, who tried to de-escalate the situation by walking away. The irate young woman then got into the front passenger seat and tossed the driver's mail, phone, and other personal belongings into the street while calling him names and hurling vicious insults at him. As the driver dialed 911 and reported that the doctor in training had left bruises on him, Ramchandani overheard the conversation and mocked him for complaining about being hit by a 100-pound woman. Responding officers arrived as she was attempting to get into a taxi. They removed her from the vehicle and instead put her in a police car, at which point she began to cry and apologized profusely for her behavior. She went on national TV a few days later to issue a public apology and managed to avoid a civil lawsuit from the driver, who was kind enough to take a small cash settlement. But the damage was already done. Not only had Ramchandani made a fool of herself in a viral video clip that had reached millions of viewers, she was fired from her residency at a Miami hospital 3 months later. Luckily for her, she managed to put the incident behind her and appears to be working elsewhere as a highly rated doctor with an impressive 6-figure salary. Number 4. Johngiri. After working as an Uber driver in Florida for 6 months and completing more than 800 trips without any major problems, Johngiri landed at the center of a kidnapping complaint that severely disrupted his life and wrecked his reputation. It all started at around 1 p.m. one day in 2021 when the Pasco County Sheriff put out an alert stating that a woman had dialed 911 and reported a physical altercation with a hidden passenger in the vehicle stowed away under a blanket in the back seat. A few minutes later, the sheriff issued an updated alert stating that law enforcement was looking for Giri in connection with the alleged incident, which by then had been reclassified as a kidnapping. Giri remained unaware that he was even being sought out until his girlfriend told him later that day. Deputies confronted the couple with their weapons drawn and took them in for questioning. Giri said that he had an issue that morning when a woman he was driving asked to change the route. He asked her to update her destination in the app, but she reportedly refused, so he ended the trip, which he said caused the customer to become outraged. As he searched for a place to safely pull over, the woman allegedly kept grabbing the door handle and yelling for him to stop the vehicle. Right as the customer threatened to call the cops, Giri found a safe spot to pull over and let her out of the car. He accused the woman of making up the kidnapping story because she was angry that he refused to divert from her route without her changing it in the app. A News Channel 8 reporter who covered the story looked at Giri's vehicle and concluded that it would be nearly impossible for a person to hide in the back seat beneath a blanket without a customer noticing before getting into the vehicle. Giri wasn't criminally charged, but Uber dropped him as a driver, and he was extremely upset by the decision. Number 3. Giovanna Pacheco Dantas. A glamorous Brazilian influencer named Giovanna Pacheco Dantas experienced a living nightmare when she was kidnapped by an Uber driver gang in Sao Paulo one morning in 2023. The 19-year-old's ride arrived at around 4:20 a.m., but shortly after she got into the car, it stopped and 2 men jumped in. They took Giovanna's cell phone and forced her to give them her passwords, which they then used to access and drain her bank accounts. The gang also sent the young woman's personal photos to their own devices, threatened to kill her, and harassed her while sending messages to her friends and family. The ordeal went on for hours before Giovanna's captors finally let her go. She was able to recover her stolen money by complaining to her bank, but there was little she could do to feel less shaken up by the incident. Giovanna was also left living in fear that the gang would continue to go after her and felt she had no choice but to change her address. She filed a police report and learned that the fake drivers were registered on several rideshare apps and had harassed and assaulted other young women. The gang reportedly had a habit of targeting victims in affluent neighborhoods. Law enforcement managed to track the men down and took them into custody following a brief shootout. Luckily, though, nobody was injured. According to the most recent update on the case, an investigation was ongoing. Number 2. Sherry Moody. During a shared ride in 2018, a Lyft customer was reportedly kicked, slapped and scratched by a fellow passenger in what appeared to be a drunk fit of rage. The victim of the unprovoked attack, 57-year-old Jose Gonzalez, claimed that the woman who allegedly assaulted him was upset at the driver for picking him up. Gonzalez accused Sherry Moody of making derogatory and homophobic remarks and of kicking him in the head with her high heel, causing a puncture wound. According to police, Moody seemed intoxicated and became belligerent toward the driver when he refused to take her through a fast food drive-thru. The driver then decided that he'd had enough of her behavior when she assaulted him. So instead of taking her any further, he pulled over, removed Moody and her friend from the vehicle, and drove Gonzalez home. For her actions and reckless behavior, authorities charged Moody with felony battery, and while she dealt with her legal case, Gonzalez filed a lawsuit against Lyft for allegedly failing to protect him as a customer. Number 1. Gabrielle Canales. In some Uber dashcam footage that went viral in 2017, a young woman could be seen reaching forward from the back seat of her driver's car and stealing money from his tip jar. Some people immediately suspected that the footage was staged, but Uber reportedly confirmed the incident to BuzzFeed News. The thief in question, identified as 18-year-old Gabrielle Canales from Long Island, New York, also spoke to BuzzFeed. She admitted to taking the cash and said that the incident had occurred months earlier. While at least one news outlet described Canales as being remorseless for her actions, she told BuzzFeed that she immediately regretted taking the money and acknowledged that what she did was childish. She also said that she repaid the driver by tipping him $5 for the amount she took, in addition to the tip she gave him for the ride. Canales further explained that the reason she appeared to be mocking the incident in several of her online posts was because the situation was long over and had been taken care of. Simply put, she felt like people were dredging up something that was dead and done, and which she'd already paid her dues for. She also said that she didn't need the video to go viral in order for her to learn her lesson, since she'd paid the driver back before the internet even knew about what happened. And while it's impossible to prove how much cash Canales took from the tip jar, anyone who's unsatisfied with her story about paying the money back can rest assured that her Uber account was suspended.
People who prey on vulnerable victims are typically ranked among the most despicable human beings in existence. Would you put a close friendship on the line or snitch on a family member for knowingly targeting disadvantaged people? Or would you keep your mouth shut out of loyalty to the person? Let us know in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Thanks so much for watching, and we hope to see you in the next one.